cautious investigators will hesitate to challenge the common belief that Robert Blake was killed by lightning, or by some profound nervous shock derived from an electrical discharge. It is true that the window he faced was unbroken, but nature has shown herself capable of many freakish performances. The expression on his face may easily have arisen from some obscure muscular source unrelated to anything he saw, while the entries in his diary are clearly the result of a fantastic imagination aroused by certain local superstitions and by certain old matters he had uncovered. As for the anomalous conditions at the deserted church on Federal Hill, the shrewd analyst is not slow in attributing them to some charlatanry, conscious or unconscious, with at least some of which Blake was secretly connected. For after all, the victim was a writer and painter wholly devoted to the field of myth, dream, terror, and superstition, and avid in his quest for scenes and effects of a bizarre, spectral sort. His earlier stay in the city, a visit to a strange old man as deeply given to occult and forbidden lore as he, had ended amidst death and flame, and it must have been some morbid instinct which drew him back from his home in Milwaukee. He may have known of the old stories, despite his statements to the contrary in the diary, and his death may have nipped in the bud some stupendous hoax destined to have a literary reflection. Among those, however, who have examined and correlated all this evidence, there remain several who cling to less rational and commonplace theories. They are inclined to take much of Blake's diary at its face value, and point significantly to certain facts, such as the undoubted genuineness of the old church record, the verified existence of the disliked and unorthodox Starry Wisdom sect prior to 1877, the recorded disappearance of an inquisitive reporter named Edwin M. Lillibridge in 1893, and above all, the look of monstrous, transfiguring fear on the face of the young writer when he died. It was one of these believers who, moved to fantastical extremes, threw into the bay the curiously angled stone and its strangely adorned metal box found in the old church steeple, the black windowless steeple, and not the tower where Blake's diary said those things originally were. Though widely censored both officially and unofficially, this man, a reputable physician with a taste for odd folklore, averred that he had rid the earth of something too dangerous to rest upon it. That is from The Haunter of the Dark by H.P. Lovecraft, your Mythos Monday for today. And this is not just any ordinary Mythos Monday. This is the last Mythos Monday, or at least the last Mythos Monday to discuss an official Cthulhu mythos. The Haunter of the Dark was H.P. Lovecraft's final mythos story, and his last story. The last original story that he finished was The Haunter of the Dark. This was written on November 5th through 9th, 1935. This was a direct sequel to Robert Bloch's The Shambler from the Stars. And Robert Blake here was meant to be Robert Bloch. Robert Bloch, who famously was the author of Psycho, the novel that became the film Psycho, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. So, Robert Bloch was a pretty big deal. He wrote a lot of novels, a lot of short stories in the mystery and horror genres, and he was a pretty big name. And of course, he was a friend of Lovecraft, another pen pal of Lovecraft, another writer who who Lovecraft mentored from afar through his letters. And the church in this story was a real church. There's a church that centers in this story. It was a church, Catholic church, in the Federal Hill District of Providence, which was torn down in 1992. This story was published in Weird Tales, December 1936. And the house where Blake, the artist and writer, resided was actually Lovecraft's own at the time that he wrote this story, which was at 66 College Street in Providence. So a lot of real life stuff going on in this story. And it does tell the story of Robert Blake. In a Robert Bloch story, Robert Bloch had a fictionalized Lovecraft killed in the story, and Lovecraft promised to return the favor. So he promptly created Robert Blake and killed him off right away. And that's not a spoiler, of course, because I just told you about it, because it's in the first couple paragraphs of this story. So you know from the start that poor Robert Blake is doomed and that he's going to die, apparently from a strike of lightning, though the window is unbroken, with an expression of horrible fear on his face. What could have happened to this poor guy? It was bad, of course, being a Lovecraft story. It had to be bad. Now, there was a church that Blake could see from his window, just like Lovecraft could see the real church from his window. And Blake became fascinated with it. So one day he took a trip down, found the church. It was all boarded up, and he broke in. And it turns out that this church was a creepy old church which had been taken over by the Starry Wisdom cult. So it's no ordinary church. It was taken over by a secret cult, a cult that was dedicated to the occult. And something was locked in the tower of this church. Now, on the way up there, Blake travels up the tower, and he finds a strange room, and in a metal box, he finds the stone, and the stone can contact. Well, I really don't think I should tell too much of the story. I will just tell you, because it's a shorter story, this one. I will just tell you that Robert Blake, through this strange stone, can contact something. And being a Cthulhu Mythos story, this something is really, really bad and causes lots of trouble. And this is actually has genuinely frightening moments in it. It's a shorter story. This kind of H.P. Lovecraft, for this story, kind of reverted back a bit to some of the earlier stories he wrote, which were shorter, supernatural type of stories. This is less of a science fiction story, which are the kinds of stories that he had written most recently, like At the Mountains of Madness and The Shadow Out of Time. But this story harkens back to an older kind of Lovecraft story, a more supernatural type of story. So it is a Cthulhu mythos, and that becomes clear, I believe, when you read it, that it can be grouped among that group of stories. It feels a little different. It feels a little retro for a Lovecraft story. I kind of feel like it's sort of appropriate that Lovecraft went out with that story. It's not his best story. Many Lovecraft scholars will point out that this is not his strongest story, but it is a strong story. It's awful good if you just take it for what it is, which is a weird horror story. It's pretty effective. It's a pretty effective little Lovecraft story. It just isn't in the same class as some of the stories that came right before this one. There's nothing really revolutionary about it or different from what he had done already. It was kind of a throwback, like I said. But it's kind of nice that he went out strong. His last story was a strong one. Wasn't his best, but it was good. It was a good Lovecraft story. Um, there are elements in it that are just typically Lovecraft. You have the creepy old cult. Uh, you've got the mystery. Um, Blake, when he's stumbling around in the church and finds the stone, also finds the dead body of a reporter. And he finds a notebook in the reporter's jacket, which gives him clues to what the situation was with this church, with this cult, and what they were up to, and what horrible thing is released in this story. It has a very Lovecrafty ending. Not the strongest ending to a Lovecraft story, but it is very appropriately Lovecraft. So for the last lines of a Lovecraft story, they are kind of appropriate in themselves. And whenever I read this story, it comes at the very end. I always feel a little sad, because that is it. No more Lovecraft after that story. It's over. He died a little while later and never had the chance to write anything more. He had a bad end. Died of cancer of the stomach or the intestines. Not a good way to go out. And he had a rough end. Poor H.P. Lovecraft. But at least his work has lived on. And I hope you've enjoyed my Mythos Mondays, those of you who watch. I will do a few more Mythos Mondays. I'm going to go back in time for 2 or 3 stories that I think are important stories. Stories like The Rats in the Walls, The Outsider, maybe 1 or 2 more. And then I'm going to shift focus and do something a little different on Mondays, but it will also be horror related. It will be kind of inspired by Lovecraft's essay Supernatural Horror in Literature, in that it will be a horror in literature day. Monday will become when I talk more generally about horror stories and horror novels in literature, and of course I will be talking more about our pal Lovecraft. But that is all in the future. For next week, there will be another Mythos Monday when I talk about an earlier story of H.P. Lovecraft's. I don't know which one it's going to be yet. I have to go through them. I know there are certain stories I'm going to be talking about, like The Outsider, Rats in the Walls, like I said, maybe a couple more. So we'll see. That's in the future. But I hope you've enjoyed the Mythos Mondays up to now. The Haunter of the Dark, a good short little story to go out on. If you haven't read it, you really ought to. So you have a splendid Monday, and I will see you here again tomorrow when I do a tag for you here at Stately Vaughan Manor. See you later, guys. Bye now.